Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I'll say slide to the organizers for moving to next slide. I'm going to start with the territorial acknowledgement. The CSPC, the Community Social Planning Council of Greater Victoria, is on the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, and we ask that everybody put into the chat your territorial acknowledgement for the lands where you are based and where your work takes place. And we'll just take a moment while people take a thought around reconciliation and acknowledgement. Thank you, everyone. So just in terms of moving beyond land acknowledgements, the Community Social Planning Council does work to ensure that reconciliation is brought to our work and bringing that an equity and a reconciliation lens to the work we do in each of our projects. And so just to talk a little bit about who we are and what we do, the Social Planning Council has been in the region operating since the 1930s. Many of you probably are in municipalities or regions where there is a Social Planning Council. They were started in the late 1930s to support community and social planning. The way we do that in Victoria, the Planning Council leads dialogues and engagement like what we're doing today. So talking about best practices, sharing leading practices, and engaging community. And we also do research. So that's the toolkit that we developed. The Housing Levers Toolkit is an example, but we do a broad range of research, anything from point-in-time homeless counts to the living wage and indexes of prosperity, so a broad range of research, and climate equity as well. And we also deliver some programs and services, like we have the biggest rent bank in the province. So that's a little about who we are as a Social Planning Council. And today's conversation has stemmed from our work around housing policy with our Regional Housing Affordability and Prosperity Working Group that brings municipal staff and councillors together to share best practices around housing affordability levers. And the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CMHC, was excited about seeing the toolkit that we produced and has been a sponsor of this webinar, and we're grateful to them for making this work possible and helping us to disseminate that levers toolkit nationally. For those who are on the call that might have any tech issues, please reach out to our team, Colton. Thanks to Colton and Aja for helping to manage the tech side of this if you have any concerns. And we'll jump into some introductions now. Just before I do, the toolkit is available online, and the team will drop the link in the chat where you can access that toolkit. So the broad set of housing levers can be seen across the in the chat. And just about our agenda for today, the CSPC we'll just do a little bit of an overview of the toolkit, and then we'll move into our planners panel, and I'll introduce those shortly. And then we'll have our general Q&A that's facilitated from the chat. So we'll be bringing questions over from the chat as we go. Please feel free to comment or make questions or comments in the chat. So back to the toolkit, the link has been put into the chat where you can go and view the entire toolkit. We'll give a brief overview today of some of those tools. So it's really specifically talking about tools for municipalities in addressing housing affordability. And it includes some best practices from across the country that are being, and in a broad range of municipalities. So there's small, rural and large urban municipalities with a broad range of examples. Go ahead. So the toolkit's organized into a set of theme areas. So the first is zoning and development policies. Zoning and pre-zoning, rental-only zoning, inclusionary zoning, streamlining development processes, incentivizing and encouraging secondary suites, accessory development units, and housing development agreements. And so this is a broad range, and we've seen a lot of change recently at the provincial level in BC that's impacting on municipal zoning and pre-zoning. But each province will have distinct contexts for their legislation around zoning and pre-zoning in some of these pieces. But this is a general overview of the kinds of tools in this area that municipalities have. Next, the next set of tools is for protecting and creating affordable housing. So rental conversion, tenant assistance, land and housing acquisition contributions, things like protection funds for ensuring that we don't lose, while we're trying to build new stock, we don't lose our old stock of affordable housing. while we're building new stock. And then the financial tools. So this is fees, charges, taxes, of course, your development fees, PCCs, CACs, density bonusing, property taxes, and the exemptions and covenants, and affordable housing reserve funds. And as you can see, this is a very broad set of tools, so we won't be able to discuss each of these tools today, but our first panel speaker will be addressing setting some of the context for the tools we're going to discuss today. We'll be zeroing in on just a couple of these. Go ahead. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our panel for today. Rebecca Mercereau is with WSIİEM Projects, and she is going to be facilitating the panel today. And she has a background both as an elected city councillor and in development and planning, so can bring both those perspectives, which is going to be really valuable in this conversation today. And then from the city of Kelowna, we have Arlene Janusik and Danielle Noble-Brett. Danielle is the manager of planning, and Arlene is a planner with the city of Kelowna. And then we have from the city of Moose Jaw, Raquel Warnichuk and Thomas Anderson. And each of them will be speaking to some examples of ways they've been building and expediting affordable housing in their community using some of these tools. And I'll let Rebecca take it away.
Thanks, Diana. Thanks very much for this invitation. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Planning with WSIİEM Projects. We come at the issue of affordable housing from two very different angles. We work on improving policy both at the local and provincial level to facilitate affordable housing. And at the other end of the spectrum, we work with a lot of nonprofit organizations trying to advance housing projects. Really pleased to CSPC for stepping up and offering these kinds of opportunities for local governments. My job today is really to set a bit of context and provide some framing in order to hand over the floor to our invited panelists today from two different municipal jurisdictions, and to really build on some of the excellent information available in the toolkit that's been published. I'm going to do that by getting into a little bit more depth on two particular categories of tools that are highlighted in that resource. The first of those is streamlining development approval processes. And I'm going to talk primarily from a BC context, but I do know this is also a focus in several other provinces with increased attention focused on a shortage of housing and in particular a shortage of affordable housing. In BC, this problem, if you will, of a lengthy, uncertain, and costly development approval processes has been quite a focus of provincial attention going back to 2019 when the province undertook a project called the Development Approvals Process Review, which produced a report commonly called DAPR. And this report actually, it's interesting, you can see the threads of continuity from that report and some of the findings of that project that are leading to some of the legislative changes we're seeing coming through at the provincial level here in BC this fall. And so it's certainly, I think, a really foundational piece of work in terms of the context of land use planning and housing here in BC. More generally speaking, though, what do we mean when we talk about development approvals processes and how we improve those? This task tends to be approached in several different ways. Commonly, local governments will undertake something called a service delivery review to really investigate the processes they undertake internally and look for efficiencies in that process. These types of efficiencies might be found in things like having online submission of applications or online review of applications across multiple departments within the local government. Or it might be doing things like looking at opportunities for staff delegation of various steps in the approval process, rather than a focus on council approval. So in BC, in the last, I would say 2 to 3 years, there's actually been a stream of funding available to help local governments examine their processes and look for these kinds of opportunities to improve them. One other way, increasingly, that both local governments and provincial governments are looking at speeding up development approvals and building more housing more quickly is actually through reducing the number of projects that require rezonings and that require public hearings. And so we are seeing lots of evidence of that here in BC, with some new legislation introduced around something called small-scale multi-unit housing, which is commonly called missing middle housing in many other provinces. So ensuring that this housing can be built on what are traditionally single-family lots as of right, without the need for rezoning. We're also seeing it in BC in the context of transit-oriented development and ensuring that there are minimum densities in proximity to transit centers and transit hubs. That type of approach is unfolding in other provinces as well, in Ontario, City of Edmonton notably, and also in parts of Nova Scotia, as I understand it. So there are several different ways in which speeding up development approvals is unfolding across the country. We're going to hear from a couple of planners with the City of Kelowna who are going to share their experience with yet another strategy to do this, which is called their infill design project. So I will turn it over now to Arlene and to Daniel.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to pull up my presentation. I'm hoping you can see that.
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for having me here today. As mentioned, my name is Arlene Janicek. I'm a planner with the City of Kelowna, and I'm also joined by Danielle Noble-Brandt, who is our Policy and Planning Manager. And I'll be giving the presentation, and we'll both be available for questions should you have any. So I'll keep it brief today, but I did want to highlight one project in particular that we've been working on in Kelowna. We do have quite a legacy of being pretty open and innovative when it comes to housing and bringing on additional housing in Kelowna. We are currently working on several initiatives kind of across that spectrum that Rebecca had kind of mentioned earlier as our opener, but I'm going to narrow down a little bit into a project that we did last year, which was called the Infill Design Challenge 2.0. So the purpose of this design challenge was to generate new ideas for infill housing that really worked for the Kelowna context, especially in some of our suburban areas that aren't too far from some of our urban centers. This is 2.0, so this is the second iteration of some of this work that we are constantly trying to evolve and do better with. Excuse me. We did a first infill design challenge in 2017. This is more of a pilot project. It was on kind of a selection of quite central lots, fairly adjacent to downtown in Kelowna, and it involved pre-zoning and fast tracking and really streamlining the development project or process rather. And through this design challenge 2.0, we wanted to expand that to further areas. So I'll jump into that a little bit here. So really big picture, I'm sure most folks on the call are pretty familiar with the concept of infill, but we just define it as adding new homes into existing neighborhoods. Really many benefits to this approach. It helps to provide housing that is accessible for a broader range of residents. I do want to acknowledge that infill on its own won't necessarily provide affordable housing and in particular, deeply affordable housing, but it does allow housing more broadly throughout the city which can in turn improve attainability. And infill is really one piece of the puzzle to opening up that broader supply of housing within a given community. There are other benefits as well. So there are efficiencies when it comes to using infrastructure. Infill development combats urban sprawl. Kelowna, we're quite constrained land-wise, so this helps us use our land as efficiently as we can. A little bit of the process. So we started working on Infill Design Challenge 2.0 in 2021. We did a background and created a design brief. Then we worked through the competition launch in August 2021. So we put this out to the architecture community, designers, folks. This was locally promoted, nationally and internationally, to call for infill development ideas for Kelowna. We did an internal review conducted by city staff, and then we vetted the submissions, and they were forwarded on to an external jury. So we brought on some folks from kind of our local industry here in Kelowna, as well as some folks from around the province for the final deliberation. The subject area for this project was Kelowna's core area. So it's the brighter boundary on the screen there. So Kelowna has a lot of hillsides and agricultural land, and of course, a beautiful Okanagan Lake. So this was the bounding area for the project that is kind of contained on those more flat parts of Kelowna. And we're really looking at suburbs that look like this, probably not unfamiliar to those of you who work across the country. These are kind of the 70s, 80s, 90s suburbs that are now not too far from some of our central areas of the city, but are still really quite a low density style of development. Something that I just want to note for this project is that we were really looking for examples of infill that would work with this kind of layout where the homes were accessed from the front. So working with the existing driveways in acknowledgement that a lot of our suburbs don't have rear lane access, which can be a challenge when it comes to accommodating infill development. So in Kelowna, we think that there's up to 3,000 of these lots within the core area that have potential to redevelop over the next 10 plus years. So we're talking about quite a high quantity of potential for development in these areas. So as I mentioned, this was a kind of trying to build on the success of our pilot project, our first infill design challenge. So we asked participants to consider a broader range of objectives. We wanted them to look at attainability, so not necessarily deep affordability, but really thinking about who would be able to attain these units and what the price points would be, how it can be inclusive with a good mix of housing, how we can achieve a high standard of livability and walkability and really make these places that people want to live and enjoy living in. Look at design excellence and kind of quality standard of urban design, as well as resiliency in the face of climate change. So we did ask folks to consider stormwater management, green infrastructure, energy efficiency, tree retention, as well as support for alternative modes of transportation. So many considerations, and we rolled that all into a scoring matrix to evaluate these submissions. So we received 56 submissions in total. We thought this was a really great uptake. This is quite a significant jump from our first infill design challenge, and we got submissions from all over, so a lot of BC and local submissions, as well as nationally and internationally. I'll just run through the highlight reel really quickly. This is the first place winner, so this is an up-down fourplex with parking in the rear. This is from a local architect that was our second place submission. It's a duplex in the front and then a duplex in the rear attached by a common garage structure with some amenity space on top. This is the third place winner that had two duplexes separated by a courtyard with some accommodations for stormwater management. And then we had an honorable mention, which was 3 small homes on 1 standard suburban lot. So it was really, really wonderful and exciting to see all of the different creative ways that the designers were able to work within the parameters of the competition to come up with some really exciting designs that worked on existing lots in Kelowna. So in terms of next steps and what we're doing now, the winning designs from this challenge demonstrated that it is feasible to incorporate infill housing into existing kind of layouts of neighborhoods in Kelowna. And these can include considerations for sustainability, diversity, attainability, livability. And we are looking at a broader infill options program right now that will hopefully incorporate these designs as a bit of a catalog. We're working with the designers right now to figure out exactly how that's going to work, but the intention is to bring these into, hopefully we can see them developed out in Kelowna. I will note, it was mentioned that there is a lot of changes going on at the provincial level in BC. So the intention is to align this work with the broader small scale and multi-unit housing regulations that will be coming out within the province of BC. So you might even see expanded areas of infill within Kelowna. And we also recently received funding from the Housing Accelerator Fund that's going to help us do this work and perhaps even enhance the work that we were already kind of chipping away at in Kelowna. So very excited about these recent developments. I'm going to stop there. I will leave it there and have some time for questions as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arlene. We will reserve some time for questions at the end of the entire session, and I'm sure there will be some. It's interesting. Of course, the primary intent of a project like this is to provide more efficiency and predictability in the development approvals process. But I have a feeling that having visual, tangible designs out there probably also has the impact of reducing some uncertainty amongst the public about, what are these new forms of housing going to look like in our communities? And we are seeing a little bit of that angst, I think, play out across the province in BC at the moment as people grapple with the implications of the broad missing middle policy in the province. On that note, for those of you who don't know, the province of BC is also planning to procure and release a catalog of standardized designs so that all local governments have access to those if they wish to use them in order to help, of course, facilitate efficient approvals of those missing middle types of units. So on to the next topic of discussion. We're going to focus on some financial tools that are discussed in the toolkit. Of course, financial tools available to incentivize affordable housing really differ across the country depending on provincial legislation. But generally speaking, they fall into a few broad categories. There are development fees and charges, commonly known as development cost charges here in BC. There are density bonusing schemes and amenity contributions for projects, property taxes, where sometimes local governments have opportunities to either reduce or waive property taxes. And another way to incentivize projects could be through capital contributions, which may be in the form of capital funding for projects, perhaps through something like an affordable housing reserve fund, or through contribution of land or perhaps other assets from the local government to developers or nonprofit affordable housing providers. Speaking from the perspective of someone who works closely with not-for-profit developers trying to build below market housing, I would say one of the most important things to think about with these financial tools is clarity and consistency. So the ability for applicants to look at a policy, understand if or how it would apply to them, and be able to take from that what the financial implications are for their project, could, in this particular environment, I would suggest, make or break a project, given how significant some development cost charges are in particular. So regardless of the tools used, I think having that lens of clarity with these policy frameworks is really important, and can often help also significantly reduce the time required for back and forth negotiation between an applicant and between the community. I should say, once again, there are significant changes proposed in BC in the context of development finance, with a piece of legislation that has not yet been debated here in BC, but effectively does a few things. It proposes to increase the scope of costs and things that are eligibly funded through DCCs. And it also proposes to provide some more, a more restrictive framework, I would suggest, for amenity contributions for projects. And it would also proposes to not permit local governments to use amenity cost charges for below market projects. So there's potentially some change afoot in this space in BC. But nonetheless, I think broadly speaking, the same tools tend to be available in most jurisdictions, and I think will remain available here in BC as well. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Raquel and Thomas from the city of Moose Jaw, who are going to share information about that city's housing incentive policy, which incorporates a couple of different, at least a couple of different financial tools.
Thanks, Rebecca. We'll just get our presentation up and running here.
Okay, that should be in place. Does that look good, or am I still showing? Yep, that's better.
Okay.
Okay,
awesome.
That's better.
So I'd like to thank the Community Social Planning Council for inviting us to present today. I'm Raquel Winarchuk, the development planner at the city of Moose Jaw, and this
Hello.
is.
I'm Thomas. I'm the new planner 1 since July of this year, City of Moose Jaw.
And our housing incentive policy, this is a relatively new policy. It's in the pilot project stage this year. It just got approved January 1st, 2023. So you've got early stages.
Okay.
And just a little plug for some background. I'm not sure if many of you are aware of maybe where Moose Jaw is, but we are 75 kilometers west of Regina, and we have some hubs. We are a Canadian Pacific Railway hub. We have a campus for Saskatchewan Polytechnic, which brings a lot of international students. We have many tourism stops. Of course, we're famous for Mac the Moose. We have the Tunnels of Moose Jaw, the Temple Gardens Mineral Spa, and just to name a few. So just some photos of the various housing we have in Moose Jaw currently. We'll just go through some data and background first, and we'll go through our report to council that we did for the policy, give an overview of our application and our process, and then our results and next steps.
Okay, so to set some context, we've got some statistics here about the housing market in Moose Jaw, which helps to explain where this incentive policy fits. As you can see, our actual population figures have been fairly stable since about the 70s, 80s, ranging between about 32.5 to 34,000 people over that period, with some ups and downs. And our housing composition is very skewed towards single detached houses, with only a little bit less than a quarter, a little over a quarter made up of other various types of apartments and other options. Furthermore, because of that population situation that I discussed earlier, a lot of our housing is actually from before 1980 in terms of its construction date. In fact, in many cases, well before 1980. And we've had a slow increase, year by year increments of new housing. But a real challenge is to, with this policy, is to revitalize our existing stock, keep it up to date. And you can also see our ownership and renter distribution here being more owner oriented.
So this is our current zoning map. The yellow that's shown is our residential districts. So it's from low to high density, kind of throughout the city on the north and south portions. And so within our official community plan, section 4 is our residential land use and housing. This is policy that we pulled to help support the incentive policy that went to council. So we particularly wanted to focus on infill for residential development, that's already within built up areas, as well as supportive housing and conservation and renewal of our housing stock.
Right. The impetus to develop the housing incentive policy emerged from the 2018 Housing Business Plan update. Following stakeholder consultation in 2019, an initial version of the incentive policy was developed, but this proposal was actually defeated in council. This sent the policy back for revisions until a new housing incentive policy was approved in 2022 with $125,000 in funding to start in 2023. And administration started accepting applications in January of 2023. Now, there were some notable changes that we made to this policy between the 2019 and the 2022 versions, including increasing the base grant and maximum capital grant amounts. The program is now funded directly from the capital budget rather than from the housing reserve investments. Mixed housing projects with a minimum of 50% affordable housing units are now eligible for the capital grant, and supportive and transitional housing projects were removed and dealt with in a separate policy.
So we have a summary of proposed housing incentives. These were within our policy or the report that went to council and was approved. So we have, I'll just quickly go through, capital grants. So we have a base grant of $3,000, and then there are additional incentives around the 1,000 mark, and they are stackable depending on what your project consists of. We'll show you the list in a later slide. And then the property tax exemption is for 5 years, 100% exemption. So that is dependent on your project as well. So like new construction for dwellings in infill, so they have a base grant of 3,000. And then if they're specific to, we have an area outlined for the downtown area and an area in our South Hill area. That's an additional $1,000. So yeah, depends on what you're wanting to do and where. And then for now, we discounted secondary suites additions or renovations, not eligible for the 5-year tax exemption, as it was just deemed too difficult for administration to draw the line at where that would be for the portion of the property. That may be something we revise in the future. As I said, it's just the pilot project. So we're always looking for comments from people and what that might look like. And then it might increase the budget too going forward. But yeah, we're still monitoring the success of our policy and going forward. So this is Appendix B. We do have 4 appendices to the policy. This is Appendix B. The highlighted areas that you see in purple are not eligible. So like Sunningdale, Ironbridge, West Heath, these are subdivisions that were in the 1980s to current. Houses are still being built here, but they're relatively newer areas. So we're focusing on the areas that are not within those purple areas. And so, like I said, the focus on downtown and South Hill. And so for our administration, we wanted to come up with a application process for us to follow. So we receive and review the housing incentive application with the development permit. When the development building permit is approved, then we provide a review, and if the conditions are met, then a pre-approval letter is issued to that applicant. We also send it to our building officials and our land manager. Once the building has reached substantial completion, which is our occupancy inspection, and that's deemed by the building official, the agreement will be drawn up by the land manager. The agreement is then sent to the applicant for tax exemption and or capital grant, whichever pertains to their project. And then once signed, the agreement is sent to finance to apply to the property.
Right. Here you can see the first 2 pages of our application. The 4th page shows capital grant availability. This application is submitted along with the development and building permit application. If the applicant submits a development permit and building application without this application, we do a quick review of the proposal to determine whether it would meet our requirements, and if so, we attempt to contact the applicant to encourage that they apply. And this here is the checklist we use to determine incentive funding for our project and how it will be awarded. If you look at table B, it also shows some of those additional stackable $1,000 increments and what they're for. So things like innovative housing, innovative tenure, secondary suites, the downtown South Hill area, accessible housing, things of this nature. Right, and here are our results from the 2023 intake. So in this period, we had only 15 new builds. However, most of these were not eligible because they were mostly in the excluded areas, basically the new suburbs. Well, 4 were eligible and 1 so far has applied. Now, this application has been pre-approved, but has not reached the final approval stage just because of the actual development and building process has been taking some time. This is also the case for some of the other projects that are eligible could still apply because they've only come in recently, in at least a couple of cases. So we will see if we can fix this in the next a few months, hopefully. But this is the current state of affairs, and we because of these results, we are thinking of ways to look at future changes.
Since it's still a relatively new policy, we feel that many developers, contractors are not really aware, even though we've tried to kind of send out a blast at the beginning of the construction season. But yeah, we're still finding that people maybe just, they're just not understanding what it is and how it applies. So we're looking for ways to improve awareness for next year's intake. Maybe do a bit of a promo for it in the spring again, reach out to all of our developers, contractors that we are aware of, and just reminding them that this is available, because we are putting forth that there will be $125 available next year as well. And then depending on that, we'll see what 2025 brings, but I'm sure that our stats will improve next year.
Thank you. And we'll take questions afterwards as well.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you both. I just want to say, very impressed by the level of sophistication of your policy and the clarity. I think that makes a really good example for others to look at. And I think importantly, you've built in a review of the new policy. That's something that I can't emphasize enough for local governments, particularly when you're trying to use financial tools to incentivize things. The context of development, of course, changes constantly in terms of costs. So it's really important to take a continuous improvement approach with those things and build in the regular review and having that open dialogue with the folks you're hoping to use the policies so that you can understand what some of those barriers are. Thanks for sharing that. I will turn it back over to Diana for a question period.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. Very insightful. I've got a list of questions actually for each of the presenters, but I'm not gonna take my privilege as the facilitator take advantage of that unless there's a slow period in the chat. So please do populate the chat with questions or comments. And if you're with a municipality that has a similar policy that you would like to engage with the speakers about, just put your hand up and I'd be more than happy. I know that there's some folks in the room that have got some parallel policies that might have some slight differences in how they're designed that might be useful part of that conversation. So put your hand up if you've got a similar policy that you're interested in chatting and talking about slight differences in how it's structured. We'll watch for that. So we've got a question from the chat around the City of Kelowna's infill development. How is it visualized into the city/model city?
Thank you for the question. I am not sure if Danielle is on the line still, but she might be a little bit better placed to answer that one. I don't work with Model City directly, but it is essentially our city's digital twin, so to say. So the idea at a very high level, based on my own understanding, would be to incorporate any of the zoning changes that we accommodate to facilitate infill development into Model City, so that we can understand kind of how infill kind of as it happens or as it as we propose it to happen would help to accommodate growth within our city, what that could look like. If we're talking about 4 units, that might be quite different from infill that's up to 6 units across a large variety of the city, and Model City could be used as a tool to understand how that impacts our planning, both in the immediate term and in the long term. So that's all I really have to say about that, but I'm happy to help connect you to someone who would have probably a more in-depth answer.
Thanks. I have a couple questions about the Kelowna example. So the first one is Edmonton also had a design competition, and they had some land set aside, 5 lots, that the winner of the competition was able to buy. So it wasn't given to them, but they did have first right of refusal on land, a set of 5 units, 5 lots that they could then build their model on. I was wondering if Kelowna considered that at all in terms of getting the winner model actually built.
Yeah, we went to actually have had a good relationship, I would say, with Edmonton, kind of going back and forth between the infill work that's been going on between our respective communities. So I think it was just a bit of a different model in terms of what they were trying to do. From my understanding, and I might be getting this wrong, was a bit more site specific with that site in mind from the get-go. Maybe there's someone from Edmonton on the call who can speak to that. And it was a bit of a different scope for our infill design challenge, which was really more about exploring designs for generic lots that would work in a variety of kind of sites throughout the city. Although, of course, there's interest in working with our development community to see these types of developments happen. So I think we've been quite open about trying to facilitate new forms of infill development, even where it's not in that pilot project area. That's all been pre-zoned, but we're looking at these new areas of Kelowna and excited to see developers kind of coming online and wanting to develop out infill in those areas. But it wasn't a site-specific project, so.
Okay, there's some questions populating the chat now. So one of them is, do Kelowna or Moose Jaw intend to the infill to be rental only, or are they strata? Are there any conditions around that piece of the affordability side of the infill?
I can just hop on since I've been chatting and then pass it over to Moose Jaw. We don't specify. We've seen iterations of infill stratified, I would say more commonly, but also some that are kind of owned by one ownership group and then rented out as rental units. So we haven't, I guess, prescribed anything related to infill in terms of the tenure, but it's something that we could explore further as the program evolves.
Yeah, similar for Moose Jaw as well. We haven't prescribed ownership or have any stipulations towards that. It's, yeah, could be single ownership, multi, yeah, we're not sure yet, but that could be something that evolves as well.
Okay. Another question was around the lot size for the winning entry. And how did the entries, so two-part question, was there a specific lot size for the winning entry? And then how did the entries maintain context sensitivity of the surrounding area? So you were looking in Kelowna to develop something that was kind of available for a generic lot, so a model approved design that could be portable. And the question is, say, how do you still maintain sensitivity to the local area?
Yeah, so I would say the easy part of that question is yes, it was a standard size lot that we kind of averaged out our typical kind of 80 suburb. So there was a specific lot size, and some of the considerations for the kind of matrix that we use for scoring would be around urban design, you know, if it kind of works well with the existing streetscape, how it corresponds to the setbacks and the neighbors and the privacy, and if it, you know, has a bit of that neighborhood fit. I wouldn't say that was, you know, the ultimate criteria for this. There were many different components that we were looking at in the infill program, and for the designers to work with and try and accomplish, but it was one of the considerations. And we did ask that they modeled out their designs with, we had kind of like just a blank slate, like SketchUp model of some of the surrounding typical forms. So you'd see kind of how their rendering or model of their proposed design would look in comparison to, say, your neighboring lot with a single family house on it. So you kind of get a bit of that understanding of the streetscape. And I would say that there also was quite a few parameters around that would kind of, I guess, control some of the massing of what this would look like on the lot. So there were setback requirements, there were height requirements. So it wasn't quite a free-for-all design competition, but rather had some bounds around it to try and really ensure that the final outcomes were feasible projects that would fit in with our neighborhoods.
Perfect. I have one more question for Kelowna, and then there's a bunch in the chat that we'll jump back over to Moose Jaw and kind of open it up more generally. On the Kelowna project, it's talking about, the question's talking about sort of the housing looks relatively expensive at a price point few on this call could afford. And so it's a two-part question. One is, you know, was there any kind of target for affordability in the design competition that you had them try to work within the constraints of some kind of affordability threshold, for one? And then second, it talks about secondary suites, duplex or modifying the existing building. And my understanding of the missing of the infill and missing middle would be that it could be outbuilding, but generally would be replacing an existing building. Is that the case? And if so, was there consideration to protecting existing stock?
I'll try to hit the highlight reel on those questions a little bit. So we did ask that for the design challenge specifically, that folks do consider attainability. We didn't go so far as to prescribe a specific affordability target that needed to be hit, but we wanted them to rationalize, kind of, you know, think through the materials, the design, the price points, and who would be living in those units that were proposed. So each application, in particular the winning applications, did come in with that. I can think of the second place winner, for example, had kind of personas of who might be accessing which unit. There was, I think, 4 units on the lot with all different kinds of configurations, different sizes, and they suggested some price points that they may be able to achieve. So I would say we recognize that this form of housing is not necessarily going to hit those deep affordability metrics, and we do have other initiatives that we're working on for kind of more deeper affordability, larger scale affordable rental housing projects, supportive housing projects, kind of that, you know, allow us to scale up. But it was a piece of the conversation, I would say, for the infill. And can you remind me of the second part of the question?
It was looking at protecting existing stock versus replacement buildings.
Yeah, so we did leave this quite open, as long as the designers could fit within the parameters of, you know, the specific setbacks, height, etc. We did have some that came in with designs for retaining, say, an existing single family dwelling on the front of the lot and then putting in some additional housing in the back. So we're completely open to that. I know that logistically it can cause some challenges like in a real world application with trying to develop that out and stratify the lot with one older home and some newer homes on the lot. But we have seen that happen in Kelowna. I would say more commonly, it's a complete redevelopment, but definitely open to seeing, you know, existing housing stock be retained in tandem with some additional housing being opened up. So, yeah, thanks.
Okay, so we're going to jump over to, there's quite a few questions here. We'll start with one from Glenn. How did the 5-year tax exemption work regarding provincial regulations? Are there limitations on the ability of the municipality to do tax exemptions?
Right. I just directed to this. So yes, there was a restriction because of the educational portion of taxes for property taxes. So in our policy, the arrangement we made was that for properties where the annual education portion is 25,000 or more, we have to apply to the government of Saskatchewan to get that waived, and they can decide to waive it or not, or to waive a portion thereof. So that's up to the provincial government, but we still make that application as part of our process.
So there's another question, and this kind of speaks to something we've addressed in the toolkit, is waiving DCCs, CACs, and taxes can be challenging, particularly for small municipalities without much revenue when looking to incent affordable housing and at the same time address issues around infrastructure needs and then other amenities. So I guess the question is, and something we talked about in the toolkit was, are there alternatives to giving away tax revenue that could be tapped before that, that you guys considered and looked at? And do you consider there to be some concerns around the revenues that are being foregone?
Right. Well, that's part of the reason why we limited it to only the infill areas, so the older developed areas that need redevelopment, and where redevelopment, well, it actually does save us additional problems later on. We've had a few unfortunate cases where buildings have been let to go and have not been maintained properly and have essentially become unfit for habitation. We've had to actually evict people in some cases at some expense to then maintain these people. So that it saves us in those kind of problems. But we also encourage, as part of policy, projects that are connected with other federal grants or provincial grants. So basically, if a project has been approved for other federal or provincial grants, they are much easier to approve for our grant as well. So we try to make that linkage.
So they met a threshold there for both affordability and having been already pre-approved for other grant processes and being tied to a specific location. Okay, well, that I think that addresses that to some extent. If folks have any follow-up questions on that one, please feel free to jump in. I was going to ask if there's discretion in the it's that you kind of wasn't terribly clear on whether or not there's discretion around the percent of tax given or the timeline. So it's sort of up to 5 years, up to 100%. So is there discretion built into that, or is it pretty much consistently applied that way? Well,
the standard format is that it's a phased in approach over 5 years, starting if year 1 being 100% and then 20% reduction every year, so down to only 20% in the 5th year. So it's sort of a step-by-step until you get to until the policy phases out, essentially. That's the default. Yeah, but of course there is some discretion in terms of how these are applied.
And there is, I'm assuming you guys have a locked-in requirement for the length of time that the housing, if it's given a capital contribution, that the amount of time that would be maintained as supportive or affordable housing?
There is, sorry, it's not necessarily for, unless it's they specifically were granted additional funds on the basis of affordability or supportive housing that wouldn't necessarily be tied to it, though they would be held to conditions of their particular application. And there is a provision for them to actually lose those funds within a certain period. I can't recall the exact period offhand, but there is a provision for that. I'm not sure if you remember the exact cutoff date.
Great. Just looking to see if I've missed questions. I know there's a few others. Does the development incentive get distributed over the period, or is it a lump sum? I think that one's been answered because you guys phase it out over the 5-year period. And then this is the same question of how are the affordability requirements upheld? Are the affordability requirements upheld beyond the 5-year period? And I guess you're saying that would be based on the agreement that was signed for the development agreement.
Yeah, basically.
That's right.
Now we have a question. I'm going to let you off the hot seat. So there's a question for the broader group. Curious about how other municipalities, sorry, it just disappeared, are exploring land as a tool for leveraging housing through partnerships with development. Now, I know this was something that was going to be on the agenda today that we didn't have the folks that were able to speak to it specifically, but I don't know if there's somebody else that in the room that could speak to how municipalities are exploring the use of land as a tool for leveraging housing through partnerships and development. I know in my conversations with the Federation, the Co-op Federation in BC, that he said the biggest barrier to getting co-op housing built is land access. So this certainly is one of those pain points for some of those nonprofit housing providers. I don't know if somebody in the room wanted to speak, if any of our panelists wanted to speak to that. Maybe Rebecca might have some examples, and then we could move to anyone else in the group.
Sure, I can speak briefly to that. A couple of examples I'm aware of, I did just put in the chat. Local governments have provided long-term leases for their land holdings to a nonprofit in order to develop affordable housing. And that typically meets the needs of senior governments who might fund below market housing. Also aware of an example in Saanich where there is an interest in redeveloping a property to increase housing density. And so the local government is proposing to go through the rezoning process itself to upzone the property and looking for an interested development partner to help build the resulting housing, some of which would be below market, but clearly there would need to be some market-based housing in order to incentivize someone to come to the table. So a couple of different approaches there that can be used, but I think generally speaking, step one is reviewing assets held by the local government.
Did anybody else want to add in on that? Any other examples?
Dan, and maybe if I can. So I raised the question. My name is Ben Walker, and I manage the real estate services at the City of Kelowna. I work in conjunction with Arlene and Danielle. And one of the tools we're looking at is like city access to land is probably our most powerful tool in providing equity into a project. And so we're exploring a model where we would vend in land above and beyond. So your traditional partnership with CSPC housing through community housing fund. And this would be potentially like directly with development through some type of long-term land lease. So we obviously then retain the asset for the future. And I'm just curious across BC, I guess, what other municipalities are maybe giving consideration to for that below market, not necessarily the deep affordability, because obviously we don't have the ability to subsidize on an ongoing operating subsidy, but more so to get that 10-15% kind of below market. And then on top of that, what other pieces? We talked about like the approval process and decoupling risk, but what are those other financial pieces that maybe municipalities can layer on to build deeper affordability? And something we've been kicking around for the past year. We hope to come to council with a proposed model, but I'm just kind of wanted to put that out to the broader group and kind of see what other municipalities are looking at.
Anybody else from another city that wanted to put their hand up on that one? I was looking at you, Andrew. Yeah, Andrew, City of Victoria. I had a feeling.
I figured. So just to highlight the example from Victoria, we've recently, within the last year, finished the Dalmatian building, which is an affordable housing project co-located with the fire department, and are looking at repeating essentially that model going forward for other capital projects, specifically libraries. City of Saanich is currently looking at doing that with one of the branches of the libraries in Saanich. I think, always room to learn. If anything, the fire hall was a challenging one because of the nature, as you probably know, of code requirements and such around fire halls. So certainly, but generally a success and really well located in terms of proximity to downtown, walkable distances, access to transit, etc. Victoria is fairly land poor, and so land acquisition strategy is really high on our list of priorities. A challenge, as you can imagine, in terms of the cost of land and City of Victoria being fairly built out, but definitely something we're working closely at and trying to do our best to leverage investment from other levels of government, whether that's on a project that they're leading or through things like Housing Accelerator, et cetera.
So Andrew, if I may, we were well aware of the fire hall and one of your Ross,
Yes,
yeah, exactly.
I figured you would have talked to Ross,
where is your guys' relationship with your local school district then? Because I see that as another potential, like layering on that housing to school. I know here we've seen, I think, 4 daycares integrated into existing schools. But I'm curious where that conversation maybe sits with, or if anybody here with school district and other like intergovernmental partners for leveraging housing on land.
So I think, that's another project that's currently under construction, was a long discussion with the school district around extending or sort of land swap from Vic High to extend an affordable housing project that was due for redevelopment. And so I think on the table, but can be challenging because it's just specifically in the City of Victoria. There's not a lot of land left, and so those conversations are always. I don't want to say a challenge because of the politics, but just a challenge because in terms of a limited resource. But generally open and successful, or at least this previous example was a successful one, and I think, there's no doors shut in terms of that.
And there's another interesting example in Victoria, actually. So you've raised the Dalmatian building, which is leveraging an existing municipal service. So we can do this with libraries. People mentioned childcare. We can do this with recreation facilities and with our fire halls, things like that, where you're going to be having a municipal amenity. You can put housing on top, and that's been quite successful. And then the school negotiating with the school district for land swaps and affordable housing to be built there. But the other thing that was done, and this is helpful for municipalities with limited land, is they worked with a developer in a project to give them extra density. So use density bonusing to get them to give up a parcel of their land they had a fairly large lot, and they gave up a small piece of that a nonprofit housing provider is going to own and build on. And I'm not sure, I don't know if Andrew, if you could speak to how that was done, if that's a long-term lease or if they actually have really given that full ownership to the nonprofit housing provider. But my understanding is that now we'll have that nonprofit housing density going up in the same space with the market housing they're building, which we gave them some additional density in return for that land. So that's the kind of land partnership that cities can do with developers and nonprofit housing providers, where the city really played a key role in brokering those conversations in such a way that the land was then made available, and the city was able to use that density bonusing ability to leverage that partnership and that land. So that is something that is a non-monetary way that the city can get involved in brokering that kind of land access for the nonprofit housing providers.
Awesome.
So I'll just say that it was a lease, and actually it was really a welcome project, because that was something that the private developer brought to the city, and so it was their idea, but certainly something that we supported. There, knowing making no qualms at the city level in terms of affordable housing being our highest priority, and so when they came to this came to us with this idea and the partnership already established, it was really easy to try and set up to support it.
And then someone from Mission has mentioned that they, again, with limited municipal land, have been looking to partnerships with church sites, and that's another one, you know, in the schools and transit spaces that church sites can be available for affordable housing, and then some city-owned land that was used for potential youth foundry. So their comment from Mission was that partnerships take time and effort, but represent a valuable approach for getting access to affordable units. And then Rebecca commented, I don't know if you want to add that about the Capital Regional District's Housing Corporation, if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is maybe an underutilized tool within regional districts in the province of BC, possibly eligible in other jurisdictions too, but the region initially put funding forward that was obviously property tax funded initially, which was matched by provincial and federal funding to build housing, and now manages over 2,000 units of housing, and actively is working on acquiring land throughout the region. It's a region-wide service, and building new housing, which uses a mixed model. So there is some market-based rental housing, and also working on redeveloping some low density below market projects that they've operated and built in decades past. So a model definitely worth checking out to try to build below market housing, which it's hard to price at an affordable point with current construction costs, but there's lots of evidence over time that indicates that when the housing is operated by nonprofits, it maintains a lot more affordability over time.
And there's some good material on the internet around the Capital Regional Districts. They've got a land assembly housing, a land banking service that is fairly clearly articulated in their bylaws there. Now, Barnaby's got a question. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to highlight another tool. I think something that we've used that's been really successful has been our definition of affordable housing. So our definition is any housing that's run by a nonprofit housing body. And so it gives them the flexibility required to match, you know, if there's a affordability requirement provided by the funding coming from the federal or the provincial governments, they don't have to worry about a third layer of regulatory or requirements under that. So we found that to provide a lot of flexibility and support for affordable projects coming forward in the city.
So it looks like City of Burnaby and City of Kelowna are talking about creating housing authorities. If there are other folks that are interested, it might be worth having a roundtable discussion separately to talk about the ability, you know, how to implement housing authorities, and bring a couple of folks that have them already into the room with folks that are interested in doing it, to kind of have some lessons learned. If that's helpful, we could certainly talk about doing that in the future. I'm not seeing a lot of other questions. I don't know if there's something that anybody's got a burning question we haven't asked yet. I think Ben mentioned on the tax exemption that Kelowna has a 10-year and that it's tied to the province waiving the school portion of the tax. There's a few other comments in the chat around some of the tax revenue issue. And then the other one in the chat that we haven't talked about is NIMBYism, that a few people coming out to engage. And the question was, is education and awareness or clarity in plans to guide council decisions enough? What have people found to be successful in helping to address some of that resistance to density? I don't know if anyone on the panel has some comments that they might to start that off. Not an easy.
Well, I can speak to a project that just, well, happened in the summer. It was in our infill area, and it was for a 5-unit project. It was close to a school, and we had significant pushback for it, and it did fail, unfortunately. So a couple big things that came out of it was parking. That's a huge issue, especially near school sites. That was a main concern. Another concern was the design of the building. We don't have architectural controls or anything like that for residential. This has been something brought up by council that maybe we should look into that. So I'm not sure what that might look like for our future, but something to note. I think those were the two big ones, but yeah, if anyone has suggestions on those, always willing to listen.
I think that's partly some of the motivation for the BC government implementing province-wide minimum zoning, upzoning, and that takes it away from that local level where the municipality is particularly challenged to be able to make it happen. I'm going to have Rebecca go on next on this one, and then Glenn, I'll come over to you as soon as we're done this.
Thanks. I'm just going to channel some of my local elected experience to think about this, because I've often found myself on the unpopular side of housing votes. I think in BC, the requirement for local governments to have housing needs assessments done is a real game changer for this, because that provides an evidence-based way to understand what the gaps in housing needs are, and it gives me or elected officials a foot to stand on in terms of, yes, we hear you're unhappy with particularities around this project, but we know we have this need, we've gathered the data. And so I encourage folks from other jurisdictions where that may not be a requirement to consider doing that. Another approach in the jurisdiction where I was a councillor in Saanich, Saanich at the beginning of every elected term did a statistically significant survey of residents to gauge satisfaction on services, but also to try to understand what priorities were from their perspective. And because it was statistically significant, it was, of course, the best quality data we could have to understand where people stood on these issues. And so when I was in the room and could, I heard from 50 angry neighbors of a proposed project who were all opposed to it, I could again, feel confident using that survey and the results that showed me, in fact, for most residents of my community, housing was the #1 issue they wanted council to address. So it gave political courage to me as a councillor. And so I encourage folks to consider that as a possibility with, also an avenue to improve your services to residents.
And is there anyone else on the panel to go? Cleo, and then we'll go to Kelowna or Moose Jaw if there's anybody else on the panel that wants to speak to this. Go ahead, Cleo.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, and great discussion. I think that in my experience at public hearings, usually the complaints and the kind of fear around NIMBY comes from a lack of understanding and really the need for education on different forms of housing, the benefits of density, and good examples of density. So I'm just throwing this out there because and for those who don't know, I work for CMHC, but I've been a municipal planner in BC for quite a while. Glad to support this good work that's going on here today. One thing that I think that we should look into, either as municipalities or as a province or even nationally, is education. Like, do you remember the Heritage Minute? Maybe we should have a housing minute. And we could have a bit of a campaign around housing density and the benefits of that for how we grow, affordability, infrastructure management, and also climate action and affordability. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, and I know Glenn's been patient there. Is your comment on the same topic as this, or jumping to something else? Are you muted there, Glenn? You're still muted. Right. Maybe we'll jump to the panel if we don't have audio with you. So we'll jump to the, if you want to throw that into the chat, and then we can come back to you if you get audio. So are there other panel members that haven't yet spoken to this issue that have something to add, Arlene or Danielle?
I popped a couple things in the chat there. So I think we are fortunate in Kelowna to have a lot of interest in seeing, of course, there is NIMBYism and opposition to housing, but we also have a pretty good legacy of embracing housing development here in Kelowna. We're growing so quickly that I think the need is quite evident, along with the affordability challenges that we're facing. So that, as unfortunate as it is, does help kind of move us towards a different conversation, not around like if we should be building housing, but what that maybe could look like. But to a point that was made earlier, it does help us, I think, to have the info competition is a bit of a feel-good, of course, a feel-good program. Of course, it gave us good ideas, but more than that, it does help to kind of demystify and have people a little bit less nervous about what info could look like in their neighborhood if it is these quite nice and well thought out examples. We've also been doing quite a bit around public engagement on infill. So I linked to our infill housing page, and we have a kind of I would say cheeky from a standpoint of local government and planning little campaign that we put together that I think are quite cute, little images around infill housing and how to help people kind of rethink what it means to have zoning that is quite exclusive and what it means to open that up and allow more folks into our existing neighborhoods. So I would encourage you all to check that out.
Yeah, did anyone else want to comment? Okay. Well, it feels like we're coming to the sort of towards the tail end of our discussion, and the community, the chat's slowing down a little bit. So I'd like to give the panel members, an opportunity to, if there was something that we've missed, sort of in the overall sort of tools, what would you say would be the most important thing for folks to take away from this conversation that are looking keenly towards building affordable housing? If there's a topic that you'd really like to dig in on a subsequent webinar, we've already got a note that Housing Authority is one of those. If there's anything else, any other topics you'd like to kind of dig in a little bit more on, do let us know in the chat. And I'll just let the panel members each have a few last comments if there's anything that you think it would be worth the other municipalities, sort of from your experience so far of that's been the most sort of effective piece. Go ahead. Do you want to start? Actually, but let's start with Moose Jaw, and then we'll go to Kelowna and we'll wrap up with Rebecca.
Sorry, I just wanted to clear up an earlier comment that I made, because we do actually have a incentive for innovative tenure. So for rent to own, life lease, land trust, co-op housing or co-housing, it's an additional $1,000, a stackable incentive. So just wanted to clear that up.
Right. Yeah. So I think that our main takeaway from our 1 year of operation with this policy has just been the difficulty of getting the word out and also creating an incentive that is sufficiently appealing. It is possible that our incentive doesn't look attractive on the face, even though we are offering quite a substantial amount when you take into consideration the tax incentive amount. It might not look that like that much. If you just look at the base grant amount of 3,000, people might not feel like that's enough to pull them in one direction or the other when they're on the fence about a project. So we might have to think about how we publicize that, or maybe simplify it so that it looks like a larger amount that we're giving out. So that, because that is after all the whole point of this is to incentivize, make people change decision making, right? So we need to get and do a better job of just making it known to developers and residents. Which is something that we're looking into for other reasons as well, our communication strategy. So, yeah.
Go ahead. And any other comments from Wistra?
Just thank you for having us again.
All right, thank you so much. And let's turn to Kelowna.
Sure. I would say we did kind of a deep dive on the infill side today, but I think one of my takeaways and learnings over the recent years is that there is no kind of one solution to the housing issues that we're facing, and it will take a multifaceted approach. I like the Moose Jaw commentary about kind of stacking and providing different incentives that can be layered upon, especially if the solutions that people are bringing to the table in terms of housing development are helping to meet some of the specific needs in your community. So extra incentives for rental housing for specific, populations that we know are more in need. But I would also say just generally that kind of streamlining the power of pre-zoning are two really powerful tools that have been quite successful in the context of Kelowna, just letting folks do more outright. It can be challenging to implement, but once it's there, we've seen a great success in our infill pilot project for pre-zoning. We pre-zoned about 800 lots, and over the past 5 years, we've seen about 370 units developed through that process. So yeah, it's been quite successful for us to kind of get out of our own way a little bit and allow that to happen. Thanks.
Maybe you can share with Moose Jaw a little bit around getting uptake. I know the City of Victoria had challenges with uptake on the missing middle policy and had to do some tweaks recently on that policy because they had no applications or very few. So they've had to make some tweaks to see if they can get some uptake. So it's you're not alone in that, Thomas, with that challenge. Anything else in terms of City of Kelowna you want to add?
Just a big thank you for having us here. I really enjoyed the conversation today.
Thank you so much. And Rebecca.
I think consistent with this idea of uptake, there's a lot of signs, I think, that the way we've approached planning in local governments in recent decades hasn't worked out in terms of the outcome we're seeing in our communities. And so I think it is pointing a lot of local governments in the direction of less prescriptive plans. And I encourage, thinking along the lines of outcome-based plans. And in order to get there, I think that requires actually quite a lot of partnership. In a lot of cases, the members of the development community, whether they be small scale, large scale, or nonprofit housing providers, have a lot to offer in terms of shedding light on some of the barriers that they face in getting projects off the ground. And in this, situation we're in which the housing shortage and affordability crisis is much more broadly recognized, I think it's much easier for local governments to come to the table with those partners and have really pragmatic discussions about how to get projects across the line. And so I think that's a great opportunity to do that in conjunction with thinking about how we can, in many ways, deregulate or become a little bit less prescriptive in terms of how we're planning our communities and the housing developments in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for participating. Our team's going to drop some links in the chat for anybody who wants to stay connected with us around any further webinars, updates, webinar clips for people who've missed it, and links to toolkit updates. So we encourage you, we're at communitycouncil.ca, and we encourage folks to stay connected with us, sign up for our newsletter and for updates, and follow us. And thank you so much to each of our speakers and to all of you who joined us today and participated in this important conversation. It's really, it's great to see such an appetite from across the country to engage in and discuss design guidelines and things like that at this level. I think it shows the activity that's happening across the country and the opportunity everybody has to learn from each other. And hopefully we can continue to share lessons so we don't have to reinvent the wheel at each municipality, but we can elevate each other and learn from each other's experiments in promising practices. So thank you for sharing those today, and for everybody for your great questions and comments.